July 1st, 1958, Inundation Day. At 8 o'clock that morning, the last cofferdam was blown. The gates of the Long Sault Control Dam were closed. Thousands of us waited for the fulfillment of headlines which had cried, "Man-made flood to roll over 35-mile-long area." That roll didn't come, but the water did. It seeped slowly over the land. This was Highway number 2 west of Aultsville at the end of the day. It took 4 days for the water to reach the 242-foot above sea level mark. Lake St. Lawrence was formed covering 22,000 acres. That's 10,000 hectares on the Canadian side alone. 7 1/3 villages, the front concession of 3 townships, along with 225 farms, roads, and the old CN Railroad were gone forever. What lay behind it all? This. Here we see the double reason for the construction, destruction, and rehabilitation of the mid-1950s. In the background are the Long Sault Rapids, 1.5 miles over 2 kilometers of untapped hydroelectric power. In the foreground, the Cornwall Canal, a prime example of the 6 canals from Montreal to Iroquois, all of them inadequate for easy transportation of goods, shows why the Seaway part of the project was needed. 5 of these riverboats, as they were called locally, were required to carry the cargo of 1 ocean-going vessel. The required loading and offloading added tremendously to the cost of the transport. The canal systems were first constructed in the 1830s and 40s by men using shovels, horses, and oxen. They had been enlarged and improved at the turn of the century. Ships using the locks could first draw only 9 feet of water on the sills. Later, this was increased to 14 feet or 4 meters. This is Lock 21 at Dickinson's Landing. The Williamsburg Canal system had 3 canals and 3 locks, including the Iroquois lock seen here. Remnants of this lock remain today on Carman Road on the way to Iroquois Point. The St. Lawrence Seaway and Power Agreement between Canada and the United States was signed May 13, 1953. However, it was July 13, 1954, before the final hurdle, an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, was found in favor of the Power Authority of New York State. Now work could start on both the Seaway and the Power Project. Men and equipment and plans were ready to begin. The formal sod turning took place on August 10, 1954, 419 years to the day after Jacques Cartier had given the river its name. The construction of the Seaway began at the east end of Montreal, the St. Lambert Lock, 768 feet long, 80 feet wide, and drawing 30 feet on the sills. The St. Catherine Lock, of like proportions, built to lift ships 45 feet, as well as lock systems and miles of dredging the ship canal. Much bridge work was needed. The center spans of the Jacques Cartier Bridge were raised an additional 80 feet to accommodate taller ships. At Montreal's west end, the Honor Mercier Bridge was rebuilt. As well, 2 new spans of an international bridge at Cornwall and Cornwall Island were constructed. To facilitate the cooperation of the United States, the Seaway construction in the Cornwall area was all on the American side. Here we see the 10-mile-long Wiley-Dondereau Canal, which stretched between the Snell Canal at the east end to the Eisenhower at the west end. The locks were needed to lift the ships 45 and 38 feet respectively. That's 14.5 meters and 12.5 meters. The main Seaway construction in Ontario took place at Iroquois. The trees on the left mark Iroquois Point, with a new lock under construction. Here, the lift is only 6 feet or 2 meters, but the lock was needed to allow ships to bypass the Iroquois control dam. The high cut here had to be made in glacial till that was almost as heavy as cement. The Iroquois control dam stretched from Iroquois to Point Rockaway, New York. It is the backup dam to regulate the water coming downriver from the Great Lakes. To date, it is seldom used. Meanwhile, just west of Cornwall, from the Canadian mainland to the eastern tip of Barnhart Island, the power project was taking shape. The walls of the power dam were going up. The kilometer, or 3,300 feet, of cement walls with the wells into which the turbines would be set, 16 on the American side, 16 on the Canadian side, took 2 years to complete. During the months of construction, shipping on the Cornwall Canal was never interrupted. A tunnel under the canal accommodated the trucks, cars, and buses passing from the land side to the construction side. New techniques allowed construction to continue during the winter. The use of air pressure allowed pouring of concrete year-round, moving from the mixing site through these chutes to the wooden forms at the powerhouse site. People in the thousands came from all over Canada, the United States, Europe, and Asia. Some stood on platforms such as these to watch the work in progress. Note the lack of guardrails or any kind of safety precautions. But later, as the numbers swelled, a few precautions were taken, such as here at the Maple Grove viewing station. 3 miles upstream, between the upper end of Barnhart Island and the American mainland, the Long Sault Control Dam took shape. This curved dam is 2,250 feet or more than half a kilometer long. Its function is to maintain the headwaters required to operate the generators. Now, this map of the flooded area allows us to see at the bottom of the screen the Robert Saunders Robert Moses Hydroelectrical Power Station. The Long Sault Control Dam is farther upriver. That antler-like water intrusion on the right is the flooded Hooples Creek, and the chain of islands with the gray roadway is our present Long Sault Parkway. This map is an artist's depiction of the flooded area. If you concentrate on the dark blue, you see the original St. Lawrence River. Look to the lighter blue, and you see the land that was covered by water. The gray shape on the right is the village of Long Sault, built to accommodate people moved from the villages of Mille Roches and Moulinette, both in Cornwall Township. The gray rectangle west of the expanded Hooples Creek is Ingleside, which was to accommodate the people of Dickinson's Landing, Farrans Point, Aultsville, and Wales, the only inland village, all of these in Osnabrook Township. Note the parkway, with its western entrance at Ingleside, its eastern point at Long Sault. This parkway was formed from the high points of land from west of Moulinette to Farrans Point, remaining above water. These new islands were joined by a series of 9 causeways and 3 bridges to form this 10-kilometer or 6-mile parkway. Note also how the original islands were changed. Sheik Island, only a remnant of its original size. Long Sault Island, greatly reduced, and Croyle Island, halved. New towns were planned. This early design for Ingleside was unaccepted by the local planning board. The many loop streets were reduced in number, with the remainder modified into crescents and half-crescents. The shopping center was moved from the far east and placed in the middle of the town. This is present-day Ingleside, called Town Number 1 until October 1956, when after a few inconclusive elections for a name, Ingleside was borrowed from a farm just west of Aultsville. After council's endorsement, the historical board and post office approved the name, meaning by the side of the hearth. Quicker off the mark, New Town Number 2 was known as Long Sault from 1954 on, preserving the name of those famous spectacular rapids. This 1957 shot of Ingleside's central core shows S.G. Wells's garage on Number 2 Highway, the shopping center under construction, and the completed Trinity Church in the upper left corner. Now then, let us begin our tour of the Lost Villages here at Gaindo Park, at the City of Cornwall's western entrance. This road running south is called Trillium Drive, but perhaps a more accurate name would have been Mille Roches Road, as this was the road leading to the village of Mille Roches from the north. Straight ahead, 1/2 kilometer out in the water, the diver members of the Ingleside chapter of Save Ontario Shipwrecks located the remains of the old Mille Roches power station. It has now become a popular dive site. The road led past this most familiar landmark, the arena. Most area teams played here on natural ice. A mild winter meant a short season, but it did not quell the fervor of players and fans. Built in 1935, the arena was one of the last buildings to be demolished in April 1958. The name Mille Roches shows the French presence in this area prior to the coming of the Loyalists in 1784. As schoolchildren, we were told that the name referred to the 1,000 rocks of the Long Sault Rapids. But Mille Roches was downstream from the rapids, and the village was long known for its quarry, pictured here. As early as 1713, the governor of New France was asking the authorities in France for money to acquire the marble, as they called it, for building material to be used in canal construction in Montreal. The quarry was exceptionally busy from 1898 to 1902, when the Cornwall Canal and other systems were upgraded and new locks were being built. Lock walls and rip-wrapping required the limestone blocks from the Bluestone Quarry north of Mille Roches. The crews of workers blasted the rock and took them out on a short rail line for transport to various work sites. Like 6 of the villages, Mille Roches, with a population of 874, was mainly a strip village along each side of Highway Number 2. With the canal construction in the 1840s, it had a section known as Old Mille Roches carved off on one side of the canal. This home belongs to Miss Lyra Fikes. It sported a cupola as a lookout over the water. Once known as the Keyser House, it was one of the larger homes in the west end of the village. The main employer was the provincial paper mill, which began operation in the early 1900s. Fine paper was made from paper recycled from huge bales brought in boxcars. In the sorting room, women sorted out the usual paper which moved on to the mixers and digesters. Once it was definite that the hydro project would begin, the machinery here was dismantled and taken to Thorold. Many workers followed their jobs, others remained. At the east end of the village, close to the bridge to Old Mille Roches, were the cheese factory in the foreground, the school across the road, and St. George's Roman Catholic Chapel beside the creek. Mille Roches Public School was a 6-room school, for many years under the leadership of Floyd Barclay. Always active in village affairs, he was instrumental in acquiring many fine features in the new school in Long Sault. Across the Silver Bridge, the road led past the powerhouse, over the weir and onto Sheik's Island, the land at the top of the picture. On it alone, 375 acres of trees were cut down before the flooding. Sheik's Island was 2 miles long and the home of several farms, most of which belonged to various Raymond families. Here we see the home of Wilfred and Ruby Raymond, and the barn. For 2 summers before the flooding, archaeologists from the University of Toronto, along with local volunteers, engaged in a dig on Sheik's Island. They found a wealth of evidence of the presence of the Point Iroquois natives. We are told that the power of the rapids was seen as a manifestation of the Great Spirit and played a strong role in the spiritual life of these early inhabitants. The island was also home to over 100 cottages, most of them on land leased from the federal government. After a period of indecision and dispute, arrangements were made to skid the cottages across the ice to the high land along Sand Bay Road. Now this rather forlorn view of cottages without shoreline lasted from early winter until the water came in to form Moulinette Island, today the home of many fine houses and only a few of the original cottages. Now we leave Mille Roches to travel a mile west to Moulinette. Here we see a Canada steamship boat moving west on Bergen Lake, the first local head pond formed in 1898 to service the Mille Roches powerhouse. In the foreground is the unused Cornwall Canal, running west for 1.5 kilometers from Mille Roches to Moulinette. Ault Park. We would travel Highway number 2 to reach the site of Moulinette. Across from Lakeview Heights is land deeded to the Township of Cornwall to replace the original Ault Park at the head of Sheik's Island. The Ault brothers, who made their millions in the Cincinnati Ink Company, had granted their home to the township in memory of their mother. Now Ault Park is also the home of the Lost Villages Historical Society Museum, a reconstructed log house where during the summer pictures and memorabilia of these flooded villages are on display. At the foot of Moulinette Road, in a small park, is this historic marker, which pays tribute to the submerged villages. As well, this stone cairn for many years bore the wooden sign with the words Moulinette, 1/4 mile. Now the French word Moulinette means little mill. However, there is no record that the French had any kind of settlement here, so it's unlikely that they would have erected a mill on this site. However, Moulinette also means winch. It seems more likely that the early river travelers made use of a winch to move their boats along the shoreline and on the side of the rapids. The true reason for the name is lost, as is the village. But there is nothing in this park to tell the casual visitor that the road which followed this row of trees would have topped a small knoll, and in the winter of 1957 revealed a dying village once home to 300 people. The building in the foreground is the Moulinette station. Now here, in a happier, active time, is the same view. The station acted as a waiting room for those who were taking our early commuter train, the Moccasin. The men waiting will travel to mills in Mille Roches and Cornwall. The man on the track is E. or Oscar Winters, the mailman. The bag on the toboggan will be handed in to the sorters on the mail car. Any letters for Cornwall will be put off at that station to be delivered later that morning. This was our mail service in the 1950s, before computers, postal codes, and junk mail, and all for a 4-cent stamp. The Lions Hotel is one of Moulinette's favored buildings. Today, Long Sault's Lions Motel is its namesake. The next township to the west, Osnabrück, was dry, so the saying went that a trip to Cornwall took 15 minutes, but the return trip might take 2 or 3 hours if the driver stopped to check the activities at the hotel. A structure finding favor in Moulinette was the Anglican Church, Christ Church. A frame building of simple Georgian style, it was earmarked for Upper Canada Village. Of the 23 churches in the way of progress, this was the only one moved intact. Preparation for the journey was made in August of '57. It was loaded on a flatbed, ready for the trip west, and we'll see the church later on its way up Highway 2. But not all churches fared as well. The United Church in Moulinette, St. Andrew's, was a stone structure. Here we see the last Sunday service in February 1958. As you see, Moulinette is almost deserted. The long rectangle behind the church is the graveyard. The tombstones have been moved to the new Union Cemetery. In all, 18 cemeteries stood in the path of the flooding. 14 of them went to the new cemetery, St. Lawrence Valley Union. Most families chose to move only recently interred remains, but all tombstones were moved to new cemeteries. Most churches suffered this fate: gutted, burned, and then bulldozed into the ground. We continue west on Old Highway 2 to the area of the Long Sault Rapids. This 1957 signboard at the Sault helped visitors understand the scope of the project. Directly across the road stood these houses, where the families had been lulled to sleep at night by the roar of the rapids. On the left was the Grant farmhouse. On the mover is Miss Anderson's. Both houses were moved to Ingleside. At the top of the hill, directly across from the rapids, was the Raymond Stone farmhouse, Ike and Bess. For years after 1958, it remained on its site on the Long Sault Parkway. Rumor was that it was to be a museum, but after years of wintering and vandalism, it was the last victim to be demolished. Now this is a two-day slide from the Long Sault Parkway. At the west end of this Philpott Island, a short strip of old Highway number 2 remains sticking out of the water. Straight ahead, past these moss farms, lay Dickinson's Landing. At the landing's east end was Our Lady of Grace Roman Catholic Church. Its namesake is in Ingleside. Here is the church from the riverside. In the foreground is the end of the 11.5-mile long Cornwall Canal. Note the limestone blocks from the Mille Roches quarry. The lighthouse was moved to Upper Canada Village, but the bass, the blue-nosed chub, the pickerel, the rock sturgeon, perch, and mudpout usually caught at this point didn't follow the lighthouse west to the new location. Coming out of the church on Sunday morning, a familiar sight was the excursion boat, the Rapids Prince, heading into the Long Sault Rapids. Over the years, these flat-bottom excursion boats, the Rapids King, Queen, and Prince, carried thousands of thrill-seekers from Prescott to Montreal over the various rapids of the international section of the river. All ships passed in front of Dickinson's landing, and some would signal the families on shore that a local man was aboard. For a village of 180, the landing was home to 5 boat captains, the Mills brothers, Tom and Walter of the Casco, the Dishaw brothers, Frank and Abby Joe, and Captain Purdy. Today on the parkway, this old strip of asphalt marks the road to Wales. At the east end of Dickinson's Landing, this road ran a mile north to the only off-river village to be flooded. Here is the complete village of 150 residents in 1956. The main street led north to the second concession. At the top of the picture, near the bush, you can see a sandy area being developed. That is today's St. Lawrence Valley Union Cemetery. But follow the road today, look over this bed of tansy, and here is the same view. On the far shore, those whitish bits you see are the tombstones of the cemetery on Highway number 2. Why was a village nearly a mile from the river flooded? Well, here is the reason. Hooples Creek, as it once was at the west end of the village. The rising waters filled the creek and flowed over the banks to engulf the village of approximately 50 houses, and continued north to the second concession, where 3 farms, Dixon's, Morrison's, and Alone's, disappeared as Hooples Creek spread to the proportion of a bay. On the creek, on the upper road, between Dickinson's Landing and Wales, were 2 cemeteries. Naturally, we called it the Cemetery Road. Here is St. David's Cemetery, a pretty country graveyard with a black and white vault and a wrought iron fence. Today, the fence is seen at St. Lawrence Valley Union Cemetery. The tall monument seen here is also in the present cemetery. The black iron frame was made in Colonel John Wood's foundry, which was once west of Lunenburg on Iron Hill. The monument is for the colonel and his family, with their names inscribed on white granite brought from Vermont. In the center of Wales stood St. David's Church, the Anglican church built in 1888. The stained glass windows went first to the chapel of St. Peter's in Ingleside and are now in Christ Church in Long Sault. Note the high stone foundation of the church. I like to think that we have grown to appreciate our past more now in the 80s and 90s than we did in the 50s. This slide is taken from St. Lawrence Valley Union Cemetery and looks south to what was Wales. The big wooded island is now called Wales, but it was Delbert White's Bush, just south of the CNR tracks. The small island to the left is the exact spot where St. David's Church stood. Visit the spot today, and you can find shards of the brick of the church. But how striking it would have been if the church had been left. Driving over Hooples Creek today and looking south, to see a church rising out of the water would have made a long-lasting reminder of our past for everyone, young and old. The main street of Wales again, with Ransom and Tremble's store, just over the CNR tracks. Beyond is the post office and the Bank of Montreal. These 2 houses on the main street of Wales, were both moved to Ingleside, the first one on Alt Drive, the second on Maxwell Street. Now this house holds the record as the heaviest house moved. It is now on the curve of Pine Street in Ingleside. Most houses moved could be prepared in half a day. The cement block house of Arthur and Mary Stewart took 3 days. The iron in the reinforced basement played havoc with the bits of the drills. Now, we know that cement blocks have large air holes in them. However, these blocks were solid cement and furthermore reinforced cement. So when the house was finally lifted by the moving machine, its weight made those 10-foot tires look flat. A different type of move took place at Fader's store. One day, a group of workmen removed the storefront. On the post office veranda sat the village supervisors, who figured the store was going to some kind of pioneer village they planned on building. How right they were. When you enter the village store at Upper Canada Village, you press the brass latchet, and you see on the window on your right the name of A.L. Fader in block letters, the same latchet and the same window that the people of Wales knew. This scene is December of 1957. The CNR tracks are gone. The station yet stands. The house, we call Dr. Moody's, though the Moody's were gone in the mid-40s, is burning. Next it will be the turn of Laflame's barber shop and Red Barn, and then Stuart Markle's store. Finally, the village is flooded. We see the wooded island now called Wales, and the small islet that could have been the home of St. David's. The silver streak is the railway track, and on the right, the blue ribbon is the road to Dickinson's Landing. So we return to Dickinson's Landing, and we leave headed west across the bridge over the mouth of Hoople's Creek. The half-crescent bridge spanning the creek was the type built by the Department of Highways in the late 1920s. The next few kilometers take us past Santa Cruz to Woodlands. On the high bank of the river here were several tourist camps, with cabins such as we see here at Camp Bell, with Ernest Campbell, owner, standing by the tuck shop. At Woodlands, another roadside strip, in the area of the present Woodland Islands on the Parkway, we see St. Matthew's Presbyterian Church. The name is commemorated by the Presbyterian Church in Ingleside. The church stood just west of present-day McLaren campsite on the Long Sault Parkway. We're fast approaching Farrans Point. This is the road just west of Ingleside today. Once it led from the second concession to the village of Farrans Point, which would have been straight ahead. Now we're at Farran Beach, where the arrow on the pillar points to the site of the village 1/3 of a mile to the southwest. In place of the arrow today, there is now a plaque explaining this. Entering the old Farrans Point from the east, this small Catholic chapel stood right by the road on the big curve. Farrans Point Lock and mile-long canal bypassed minor rapids that you can see on the right. Upbound boats used the lock to raise them 3.5 feet, necessary to compensate for the drop in the water level. But most of the downbound boats could navigate the rapids. This scene of the lock house and a river boat evolved quickly into this, the end of the lock on day 2 of the flooding. Today we can see the sand of Farran Beach. To the southeast of the beach, the silver streak was Highway number 2, with the deeper blue showing the original river, all that remains of a village of 200 people. Now let's travel west of Ingleside to Upper Canada Migratory Bird Sanctuary. When you turn in and drive south, you are on the old road leading to Aultsville. Before the curve, the road ahead leads straight to Old Aultsville. You can walk the streets when the water is low, but just over the old railroad bed is the remnant of another little road. This was the scene at this very site prior to 1957. Between Jarvis and Shaver's store, the road ran west to the Aultsville Industrial Park, where you would have found a sash and door factory, Edwards, later Borden's cheese factory, houses, a farm, and the CNR station. Hence, the station road led to this frame station. The building was loaded on a flat car. It was taken west a mile or a kilometer or two and offloaded to where it is today, west of Upper Canada Village. The track under this engine is the only piece left of the original CNR. Aultsville, first called Charlesville, like all those along this stretch of the St. Lawrence, was a strip village, this one of 312 people. Coming south toward the highway, the road ran past West Bedingfield's store. At the corner was the Bank of Montreal, the building to the east, Defoe's store. Many buildings in this village were made of brick, since Aultsville had its own brickyard, and as well a pottery, once operated by the Elliott family. On the south side of the highway was this large brick home, which belonged to the Ault family, after whom the village was named. Nelson Street ran south to the government dock, where for a half-century a ferry service took people, cars, and trucks to New York State. The dock was a regular point of call for small steamers such as the Britannic. But in its last years, the dock served only the fishermen and the swimmers of the village. This view of Highway 2 shows the transports of the day using the single open lane after this major storm. It was the only highway from Montreal to Toronto and saw all the traffic that made that journey. Snowstorms seem to have brought out the people with cameras. Hagerman's store and the Morgan house next door show the snow piled up from that same storm. Now this house was once the farmhouse of Michael Cook, the man responsible for introducing the Holstein Friesian cow to Canada. The oval window was its unusual feature. Coupled with its age, it was deemed worthy of preserving. We know it today as the Doctor's House in Upper Canada Village. At the east end of Aultsville was the home of Dr. Edwin Brown, the epitome of a country doctor. Making house calls over a large area, including the islands, at all times of the day and night, weather was seldom a deterrent for the doctor. At the west end lived Mr. and Mrs. John Laux. From this spacious home, the Laux moved into a modern bungalow where Mr. Laux remained a pillar of the Presbyterian Church until into his 90s. West of Aultsville was the boyhood home of James P. Whitney, who went on to serve as Ontario's premier from 1901 to 1909. Ironically, he was one of the founders of Ontario Hydroelectrical Power Commission, whose advance resulted in the destruction of his boyhood home, which by the 1950s was the residence of Mr. and Mrs. Edward Knuffin family. Aultsville was the site of the burn conducted by the National Research Center. 6 houses, the school, and the fraternity hall were wired and set afire, with the resultant readings helping to develop smoke alarms. Charles Shaver's house next to St. Paul's Anglican Church was part of the test known as the Aultsville burn. Now we see Christ Church being walked westward to its new home. It has reached Aultsville and is within a few miles of its destination. House moving was a very popular feature of the work done during the 4 years. House moving began on August 18, 1955 in Iroquois and ended on December 5, 1957 in Morrisburg, when the last of 525 houses was moved. This is Victoria Lodge, tourist home from Aultsville, on its way to its new foundation on the corner of Farrans Drive and Maple Street in Ingleside. The Rice home was moved from Wales to the corner of Maxwell and Santa Cruz in Ingleside. The largest house moved was this 15-room nursing home operated by the Williamsons in Iroquois. This home, formerly Vic Abrams, was on the high bank at Santa Cruz, its double balcony allowing a river view par excellence. Today on Pine Street, the double balconies remain. The view, however, has changed. These identical houses were once hydro houses at the transformer station at Maple Grove, east of Mille Roches. Here they are on new foundations east of the Catholic Church on Bethune Street in Long Sault. As mentioned, 525 houses were moved. Only 2 didn't make it. And here is one shrouded in its tarpaulins. Perhaps the hope was out of sight, out of mind, but someone is always lurking about to record our mistakes. The monument to the 1813 Battle of Chrysler's Farm was erected in 1895 by the Canadian government. Here in its old setting, we see there was scarcely a pull-off parking area beside Highway 2. Moved a mile and a half north and given prominence on this hill just west of Upper Canada Village, the monument was rededicated and still looks out across to the American side. The Clark-Garlow family lived just west of Aultsville in this brick farmhouse. Once Cook's Tavern, it had been commandeered as the headquarters of General Wilkinson, leader of the American forces, at the time of the nearby battle at Chrysler's Farm. The St. Lawrence Parks Commission wanted this structure as its tavern in the pioneer village, so it was braced for the move. Then the bracing was reinforced. Now ready for its move to Upper Canada Village. And here we see the tavern in its proper and familiar place. Note that Christ Church has completed its journey as well. Now, it was not the brick of the day which caused the problem in moving, but the soft mortar from early times. The mortar in Cook's Tavern failed the test, and so the tavern was stripped of its brick and re-bricked as we know it today. The destruction included burning, bulldozing, and dynamiting. The lock houses on the Morrisburg Canal fall victim. The businesses on Morrisburg's main street were taller buildings as we see here. These buildings were gutted and in some instances burned. One of the most popular spots for area dancers, Castleman's Dance Hall, was full for the Saturday night dances in the 30s and 40s. The high-fronted 2- and 3-story buildings required explosives to reduce them to rubble. Further west, part of Iroquois' Main Street, the village of 1,000 people, was moved to the northeast of the old site. Iroquois became known for its famous sign, "We have to go, but watch us grow," the promise of the 50s only partially fulfilled in the 90s. One of the most awaited events was the draining of the Long Sault Rapids. The purpose of diverting the river was to allow the completion of work on the north section of the Long Sault Control Dam. Step 1 was to cut a 400-foot wide, 2,000-foot or 600-meter channel through Long Sault Island. To do this, a steam shovel called the Gentleman was brought from Kentucky to eat its way through to the south side. It took big bites out of the island, moving 15,000 cubic feet of earth each day, 15 times what a conventional shovel would have done. The new channel diverted the river to the south side, but to block the flow on the north side, a cofferdam was needed. At first, truckloads of rock and earth were dumped into the swift waters, only to be borne away. That meant steel plates needed to be driven into the riverbed and infilled. Little by little, the cofferdam grew across the channel to Long Sault Island. Then the pumps at the east end began to draw the water from the rapids area. This is an aerial view of the cofferdam, the rapids, Old Highway number 2, the very area of the present Macdonnell Island on the Long Sault Parkway. The farms on the north side of the road were mainly in the hands of the various Moss families. Now people flocked to see the secret of the rapids. Here Eric Rice, donor of many of these slides, views one of the thousands of rocks. Thousands of walkers among the rocks saw pools of water, mostly cleared of fish. This rock became known as Table Rock. There were rocks and more rocks, a mile and a quarter of rocks. Little was found by the searchers, pieces of iron, an anchor or two, mainly metal objects dropped from ships. But the scene was rock, 2 kilometers of them. More rock, and evidence of the odd rock formation. This slide shows one of the many interesting potholes and how they came to be. In the foreground is the pointed, harder rock drilling its way into the softer underlying rock, its driving force being the swirls and eddies of the water. When the hole was big enough, the loose rock would be swept away, leaving an empty hole such as we see in the background. The largest pothole was people-sized, over 5 feet, or nearly 2 meters deep. The most unusual find were these, found by 17-year-old Arthur Raymond of Sheik Island. Variously called cannonballs, mortar shells, even ballast, it is credibly accounted to a barge sunk in 1813 when General Brown's American forces attempted to move downriver in an effort to capture Cornwall and Montreal. When all was in readiness, the flood waters rose on those first days in July 1958. Here, spectators on the highway in Mille Roches watched the Mille Roches Bridge being swamped. Barges under each end of the bridge lifted it free of its cement base, and it was towed downriver to Lachine. At the end of inundation day 1, people were able to walk parts of the old village sites. This is a scene at dusk on Highway 2 west of Aultsville. While the waters rose, ships at anchor waited at each end for Lake St. Lawrence to form. They would use the new locks and follow the new channel dredge to a depth of 27 feet, over 8 meters, all the way to Montreal and beyond. We returned to the rapids, the most spectacular and beautiful sight in our area in pre-flood days. In this spring of 1993, the St. Lawrence Parks Commission, just to the west of this rapid site, has erected information display boards with pictures and text that will keep alive the history of this area. The Lost Villages Historical Society's cooperation with the parks was freely and happily given as a fulfillment of our mandate to preserve, collect, and display our local heritage. Today on the Parkway, this is the scene on Macdonnell's Island at Long Sault Lookout Point. A grove of trees is the only pre-flood marker of what was. It is difficult, almost impossible, for the casual visitor or anyone under the age of 35 to believe that from this spot, the scene prior to 1955 would have been this, where the water is now over 70 feet deep. Seeing a small strip of the old highway number 2 still existing is a sign that once something other than the tranquil area it is today existed here. On the left were the 2 houses shown earlier across from the rapids. The water in this gully would be 30 feet deep. But when the waters crept in over this area of the Sioux and the highway, all action, as we knew it then, did come to a dead end.